joining us on YouTube. We are yet again here on Shabbat, ready to have yet another experience of the divine with this learning of the ancient pictographic Hebrew, the ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle, and the whole Bible or Hebrew roots movement. Okay, so at any rate, obviously, for those who follow the rabbinical calendar and follow the Hillel postponements, Passover is going to be on, Monday. For those of you who actually were able to cite a 1%, predicted 1% new moon, Tuesday is going to be the actual day of Passover for those who are sighting the moon. The Michael Rood calendar, the astronomically accurate calendar, and our observances ourselves puts the new moon on the date that we would have from the evening of the 23rd to the evening of the 24th. Why is this relevant? Well, because if you are a Jew, you are celebrating Passover on Monday. If you are observant of the moon on the day of that first crescent, which was supposed to be a 1% crescent, then you obviously are going to be keeping it from the evening of the 22nd to the evening of the 23rd. You're going to eat the Passover sometime in that time period. However, After His Heart Ministries is going to go also with the Michael Rood calendar this year, but also just going to go with the convenience of when the congregation could meet and that kind of thing. We're going with the 24th of this month. And so obviously a little bit of confusion, obviously a little bit of complications, but in the end, all the same principle and actions to be carried out, eating of the lamb, etc. As of last night, on the eve of last night, for the official Passover of After His Heart Ministries, which will be from the 23rd at sundown until the 24th at sundown, last night at sundown was the beginning of the commandment to watch the lamb. So we are actually going to do that. We're actually going to do something today. We're going to examine a part of this function of watching the lamb based upon an understanding or thought process of what and who and what the lamb is. Okay? So how do I put this? Everything you think you understand about God is about to change. Okay? All right. Wonderful introduction, right? Okay. So let's start at the beginning. The first thing that we need to do is we need to understand the difference between Greek logic and Hebrew logic. What is logic? Logic is a way to determine or predict a future event and also to come to a present conclusion based upon data, right? And that data is supposed to override any traditions, any attitudes, any cultures, whatever. The data is supposed to say the thing that would become the doctrine. Okay? I'm sure that probably just made a whole lot of sense. So let's get into it. The first thing that we need to do is we need to accept that logic from a Greek perspective is linear. That means that it goes from point to point to point to point. Take a bowl of spaghetti and take and mark one noodle with some food coloring and mark the other end of that noodle with food coloring and then mix it up. Okay. So now that every single piece of spaghetti that food coloring touches is a path through the logic of that spaghetti. Now you take that same piece of spaghetti and you stretch it out and you have it be just one singular line. That is Greek logic. You go from point to point to point. This, because of this, because of this, because of this is true. But in Hebrew block logic, we have something interesting going on. Where a piece of spaghetti intersects that other spaghetti is another trail of logic. Still arrives at the same point at the end, but it's another trail of logic to be followed. Now, there's a few reasons why this is important, okay? The first reason is that objects that normally would not be connected to each other, ideas that normally would not be connected to each other, thoughts that would normally not be connected to each other are all of a sudden connected. And all of a sudden, there's no such thing as coincidence. Everything happens exactly the way it's supposed to, and there are multiple intersections into that information. Now, there's a few reasons why that's significant. The first of which is that A, Greek logic will follow the path of least resistance through a linear process. Block logic does not follow the path of least resistance, but follows the path of most interest. Okay, I can tell you that an AI actually operates more in block logic than they do linear logic. Now, originally, they tried to create AI to follow linear regression logic. However, they found that it was easier to integrate a deep learning or natural learning. And that deep learning and natural learning has multiple webs of connections into logic, okay? So why would that be important? Well, because you need to remember that every single last Hebrew word in lexical form is a verb, okay? You can have nouns, but they will be carried back to a lexical form verb. Those verbs are either child roots or adopted roots. Those child roots or adopted roots then equate to what? A two-letter pair, a two-pictograph pair. Okay, and that pictographic pair has a concrete, straight up, what you can see, what you can hear, and what you can feel connection to that later on noun in the Hebrew language. Now, we could go through the evolution of the Hebrew language logically. We could go through the evolution of the Hebrew language as a linguistic process, progression, right? So we start out with some grunts, we start out with some pictographs, and next thing you know, later on, we are speaking a Middle Eastern dialect, right? Okay. Starting with ancient Semitic, running through Akkadian, running through Sumerian, these ancient languages that, of course, are actually known and can be spoken correspond to the Hebrew language that is spoken today in Israel. Now, there are some relevant and important parts of that information that are lost, and that is that there is not a connection right now, per se, to the pictographs and the modern Hebrew when it comes to the brain of a person living in Israel or the brain of a Jew. The pictographic connection actually came through a Christian avenue. Now, why is this important? Well, I mean, take, for example, Rabbi Hirsch, a Jew, a rabbi who had a very strong understanding of the etymology of Hebrew. That's the study of the origin of words in Hebrew, had an understanding of cognates, that's words that sound like words or letters that sound like letters, where a word is spelled one way at one point in time in history and then flips over to another way. And then in addition to that, he understood dialect. He could understand the difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazi dialect. Okay. And then in addition to that, he understood permutations. Permutations is something that people just are not ready for. And that is that there is actually a block logic connection between the switching of the letters. And if you accept that, then we have a whole nother level of mysticism in the Hebrew language, because now words, no matter what way that you spell them, what sequence you put the letters in, now becomes any connection to the same concept. Okay. So obviously that then leads to a level of complication. Well, I hear on a regular basis a Christian say, "Oh, I keep it simple. I always try to keep it simple. It's just a cross and him crucified." Okay, keep telling yourself that, because I can tell you right now, the intensification of all power in the universe is not simple and is definitely very, very complex, complicated, undefinable, limitless, and we are unable to actually describe what it is. So we use our finite brains and we make connections. We do anthropomorphic processes by which we start to understand a father, a God, a son, a friend, a relationship, a husband, etc. But the truth is none of that is actually real. None of that is even remotely touches upon the actual energetic connection between a human being and the intensification of all power in the universe. One that you just can't do with these human processes. Okay. But even though that's true, and even though that there is that level of function or dysfunction in the thinking of whatever, in the end, what we have is we have a religion, a dogmatic fundamentalist tradition religion that has definitely not maintained the integrity of the data. And furthermore, unfortunately, has taken the data, corrupted it, and then created actual presuppositions that then become what? The basis for logic. Okay? One of the things I want you to think about, let's say that we just go with something more American, more modern. Let's think about the American slave trade. Okay. The American slave trade had a logic or theory that because people lived in the bush, that they were inferior to the modernized, sophisticated process of Anglo culture. When in reality, it wasn't until they started seeing, say, for example, the Native Americans using guerrilla warfare, they began using guerrilla warfare, that the tide turned on the Revolutionary War. In fact, instead of standing in the field and taking a bullet, because that's where the gun was aimed at, you stood there and took that. The next group can run in and stick with a bayonet at the guy while he's reloading. Changed to a logic of hiding behind a tree and taking cover and shooting the gun and taking out 3 or 4 men with ever even being shot at. That did not come from Anglo culture. So the logic was that they were an inferior species, right? And so they believed that they could subject them as they could an animal to burden, etc., etc. Now, the sickness of the human condition plays a role here, but I'm not going to get into that, because when we start getting into sadism and we start getting into, justifiable torture, etc., etc., we start to get into the dark side of the origins of this country. And I'm really not necessarily trying to go there. We can go there, but not today. So the reason I bring this up is because then we start to understand that culture has a tendency to try to dictate how things are. Well, there's no exception when it comes to the Hebrew language versus the English language and the translation thereof, and then the formation of doctrine. We are challenged with three different aspects. We are challenged with absolute Orthodox Jewish tradition. We are challenged with absolute Catholic tradition. And then we are challenged with pagan infiltration. Okay. And what I mean by that is that there are people who actually they had kind of combined the culture of the pagans in with the culture of Christianity. Then we have what? We have the people who are kind of left in charge in Rome as a religious entity to try to formulate some form of administration, right? Then, of course, when we get into the Jewish side of things, we have the same thing. We have the rabbis actually formulating a convention of rabbis that then becomes this written down documentation. And we say, okay, well, we totally reject Judaism, right? If we go back to 325 AD, we go back to Council of Nicaea, they made it abundantly clear that they wanted to be different from the Jews. Well, but what's interesting about that is that it doesn't stop at wanting to be different from the Jews, because you know what? Let me just say this. I'm a Jew, the tribe of Levi, Kohen, right? A son of Aaron. However, in that thought process, that doesn't stop me from being objective in the understanding that rabbinical tradition can and possibly will on a regular basis dismiss the heart or the higher Torah or the written Torah itself. Now, at that same time, I'm going to come to their defense and say that when the Pharisees came together and began to try to formulate a plan to reseat the line of Judah into the royal kingship, rulership position, and to remove the false doctrines that were being propagated with the Sadducees, and also somehow prevent the people from being exiled again, it was a noble cause. Did it turn out good? No, not necessarily, because we come back to the human condition every time. We'll come back to the human condition every time. Pride, fear, insecurity, right? And so we have, for example, the house of Shammai, a Pharisaical order, actually at one point in time murdering, justifying in their brains, murdering a different sect of Pharisees, house of Hillel, in order to execute some actually really unimportant doctrinal differences, and to make that be the mainstream. Yes, quite literally, rabbis murdered rabbis and believed they were justified because they were eliminating it wasn't even heresy in their eyes. It was just a lesser version of the strictness of Torah, and thereby possibly was going to result in some sort of exile again. They're trying to prevent this, right? Why do I bring this up? Well, because in its simplicity, there we go with simple, right? But in its simplicity, tradition is a action of repetition that is based upon a thought process of how you should do something based upon a written down commandment and or an enactment of the Pharisees or of the Sanhedrin, as it were, to what? To make a ruling on how to interpret a Torah amendment. Well, the reason why this is important is because here we go again with tradition. We go with man's presuppositions, right? We go with a lack of objectivity here, right? And in that process, then we have this traditional stuff over here. We have this dogmatic fundamentalist stuff over here. We have this very different God, very different Messiah, very different ancient Hebraic culture being stamped out by men deciding how something is supposed to be. Well, today's message has no exception to that, because one of the things that we're going to have to get into is the concept of Christianese, the concept that Christians actually have created a tradition out of a word that does not mean what they think it means. We see this over and over in Christianese, right? However, in that process, we also need to understand that it is every single last human being that does this. Who was the first person to create tradition? It was Adam. How do we know? Because Eve responds to the serpent, we of every tree in the garden we may eat, but of the tree in the midst of the garden we are not allowed to eat it, nor are we allowed to touch it. Now, if you go back to the original commandment that Yahweh gave Adam in chapter 2, verse 17, you will find that is not the case. You will find that it doesn't say don't touch it. In fact, Adam was supposed to cultivate the garden. So whoever came up with that, I'm going to say, with a relative amount of authority, Adam is the one that came up with that, and Eve was repeating what he had said. Why? Because Eve was not present when the commandment was given. Eve was not present when the commandment was given. It wasn't like we see in Torah that Eve was created and now God repeated all of the commandments he had given Adam, which was what? To have dominion over the earth, over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and the beasts of the field, to subdue it, multiply, to replenish the earth, etc., etc. And then in addition to that, not eat from the tree of good and evil. And in addition to that, name the animal. Okay? All of those commandments that were given was before Eve ever came out of the rib. So now Eve comes along and boom, all of a sudden she has knowledge of the tree of good and evil. Guess what? That was Adam, right? Adam is telling her, hey, don't you touch that thing, right? You go out into the garage and you're sitting there trying to do something, and the lady comes along and starts organizing your stuff, and you're like, hey, whoa, don't do it, right? Okay, so we already have that don't have that syndrome. So anyways, Adam is the first writer of what? Of tradition, first writer of a takanot, an enactment that is what? That is extra fencing around Torah. Didn't want his wife going near the tree, so you don't touch it, right? Okay, so in principle then, as we see this going on, we can understand it's kind of human nature to create tradition. Well, one of the biggest reasons why this is so important is because of what we're going to get into today. So the way that I want you to think about this, in fact, let's document this on the board, okay? On the board, we have, let's just go here. All right. Now, let's see. Let's name our pins or give our pins some color here real quick. Actually, you know what? I think I actually want to stick with that green. And the thick one will do red. Now we'll do orange. And then my finger, we will do light blue. Okay, here we go. So at the bottom of this thing, we have tradition. Right? And the whole idea behind tradition is an idea on how to interpret Torah, right? A how to carry out an action. Let me give you an example of this really quick, okay? My friend Mike, when he was first coming into Torah, I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful transition into Torah. Had just kind of started asking some questions. We happened to run across each other on TikTok, and We had this long old discussion, probably a 2-hour discussion on the phone together. And afterwards, he had definitely decided that it was time to step into Torah observance. And the first thing he wanted to do, he asked me kind of where to start and asked some other people where to start. And I said, well, let's start with the Shema. Let's work through that, and so then he understood he wanted to put mezuzah on his gate, right? Well, being of frugal means, he went ahead and he got a waterproof container, and then he wrote what he believed to be needed to be in that, right? This is nothing, there's no rabbis are influencing him, no Christians are influencing him. He's reading Deuteronomy himself, right? Reading chapter 6 and looking at these verses and deciding what he believes it means. And the man literally wrote everything down, put it in a waterproof container, and hung it on his gate. Boom. Torah, right? So what do we call that? We call that tradition. We call that and how we would interpret. Now, of course, it's called halakha, right? In Judaism, it's called halakha, how you interpret the Torah. But once that starts to become something that more than one person practices and also they consider to be a rule, then it's tradition. Tradition is always going to be what? Extra stuff than what was actually written. So let's look at this now. So I'm gonna take a few liberties here when it comes to presuppositions, but I think you'll understand why when I do. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to look at tradition, and I'm just going to flat out put here fence. Okay. So this is the first level of fence around Torah. You shall not touch the tree, nor shall you eat of it, right? Okay. Tradition, right? It's something extra. It's just that little extra little fling or flare into a process. Now, according to some messianic rabbis, let's talk about that for a minute. What's the difference between a Christian pastor, Orthodox Jewish rabbi, and a messianic rabbi? A Christian pastor teaches a people how to adapt themselves progressively with a modern lens of ancient Christian concepts. Let's say ancient religious concepts. Okay. What do I mean by that? A pastor will teach you how to modernly interpret the Bible. Okay. What do rabbis do? Rabbis teach a people how to maintain the integrity of ancient traditional religious practices. What does that mean? Instead of modernizing it, they make rules that will stand the test of time. And they maintain those rules. So they're more fundamentalist than they are progressive, right? Now, we do have some Christians who think that they are doing that, okay? Where they believe that they are maintaining the most logical, fundamental, truthful aspects of the Christian lifestyle. The Jews, on the other hand, are maintaining ancient traditions, and they're maintaining them with the integrity and belief that if they don't, that they will lose their identity. Okay. And there's actually a little bit of warning in the prophets about that. In fact, Yahweh actually says to the children of Israel in Deuteronomy, not only the children of Israel who were standing there that day, but the children of Israel who were going to come, that would be you. Yahweh says to the people, do not worship me the way the nations worship their God. Do not learn their customs or desire to understand their traditions. Okay. So in principle, he's telling them, hey, look, do not act like them. Do not worship me that way. right? Okay, fine. So now in principle, as we're looking at this, then we start to arrive at this idea that there is this fundamentalism, there's this belief in maintaining integrity. So what does a messianic rabbi do? Well, a messianic rabbi takes kind of the best of both worlds. He's going to take the latter writings, the biography of Yeshua in its whole, right? In the synopsis, not synopsis, the harmony of the Gospels, or the harmony of those narratives, and is going to give that to the people in the lens of Torah observance. Okay, that's kind of what a messianic rabbi is going to do. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, because when we're looking at traditions, we need to understand that traditions are these fences that kind of wrap around the written Torah, have a little bit interpretation depending on who you talk to. So the reason that's relevant is because Messianic rabbis say there's about 1,048 commandments, okay? So we're going to go ahead and put that up here. 1,048 commandments. We'll go ahead and do it in the green. 1,048 commandments. And what that is it is Torah plus Christ. So somebody took the time to look at the commandments of Christ and look at the commandments of Torah and add them together, and I think this is the number that we arrived at. Okay. Now, having said that, that number may vary from opinion to opinion. I really don't care. All right. So the next level of this is going to be what? It's going to be an actual explanation of commandments, but not tradition. So we're going to eliminate tradition and we're going to eliminate the commandments of Christ. And why am I saying we're going to eliminate the commandments of Christ? Because what we're looking for here is the simplicity, right? So that the next level, what we have is the compiled 613 commandments. Okay. And those 613 commandments are actually an interpretation of something which we're going to talk about. However, this was compiled by Rabbi Maimonides, okay, or Rambam. Now, the next level after that then is going to be what? It's going to be 10 commandments. Okay, 10 commandments. Well, you guys know where this is going, right? What's the next level? 2 commandments, right? Two commandments. And at the very, 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 very top, we have what? We have one single commandment to what? Love. Okay, so we have traditions, which is thousands of commandments. This is the Westminster Confession. This is the Talmud. This is all of the different traditional beliefs and processes, bylaws, etc., of the original compiled 66 books of the Bible. What is this? This is Torah and Yeshua's commandments, right? 1,048. This is eliminating tradition. This is going straight with what we would see in those 66 books, right? This is extra biblical. This is biblical. What's this? This is only Torah. Only Torah. Only the first 5 books of the Bible. What's this? This is only Exodus chapter 20, right? What's this? This is the 2 greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then, of course, one single commandment. He says, a new commandment I give you. Why did he say a new commandment? A new commandment I give you. Love one another. right? Greater love hath no man than this, but that he lay down his life for his friend, right? And of course, yes, talking of his death. But the point is, at the top of this pyramid, which is exactly what this is, right? This is a progression from a whole bunch to something really simple. Now, this is what Christianity claims. Let's talk about this for a minute. Christianity claims that this is actually what they do. Okay. How many people have talked to a Christian who are Torah observant, and the Christians say, "Oh, I'm only commanded to love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself." And that's the only two important commandments, right? Now, there are some that say, "Oh, no, there's 49 commands of Christ. We need to put those in there." And then there's others that say, "No, there's another 400 commandments in the New Testament." Okay, so first of all, let's clarify something. Let's work this out. The two greatest commandments, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might, are two great pillars. And within those pillars is contained the 10. How do I say that? Well, on the love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your might, you have the first 5. Some people say the first 4, I say the first 5. And I will tell you why. Because there is only one commandment with a promise. The first commandment that has a promise is love your honor your mother and father, that your days may be long in the land, right? That's the first commandment with a promise, and Yeshua identifies it that way. But the reason why it's important is because it falls into the honoring God side. It doesn't fall into the not honoring God side. How do I know? Because in general, although there is definitely some commandments in Deuteronomy about the disobedience of a child as being a drunkard and a glutton and a lazy person, and you being able to take them outside the city and stone them to death, we're probably not talking about a 5-year-old. We're probably talking about more like somebody who is at least able to go up to what would be 20 years old. Okay. There is a relevance to this, and that is that generally speaking, the love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, is going to contain, "I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not have idols," right? And so that is like the first 2. And then, of course, "You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain, and honor the Sabbath," right? "And love the Lord," or honor your mother and father. Okay. Those 5. And then on the other side, we have don't steal, don't lie, don't commit adultery, don't covet, and don't murder. Okay. Now, what I can tell you is that generally speaking, the reason I split those up the way I do is because there is not really actually a commandment to put to death somebody who dishonors their mother and father. There's a justifiable homicide of a man who is out of order after he has come of age, as it were. And I'm sure if we looked at like Tractate Sanhedrin or even Baba, we would probably find that there's a lot of rules before you can put your kid to death, right? But when it comes to murder, theft, etc., we definitely have commandments to kill that person. Okay, adultery, stone them to death. Murder is eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, etc., etc. So sins unto death are under love your neighbor as yourself. Sins to the Lord or to Yahweh are those 5: Sabbath, name in vain, idols, and not making him the Lord God, and then of course honoring mother. Okay, so in that principle we have these 2 great pillars, but then what we find out in the 613 is how to determine whether it's murder or not, right? So we're given instruction on how to make a judgment in a certain direction. For example, let's talk about stealing. Stealing is punishable by death, but only if the person is not known and only if they come in the night. It's a make my day law that's conditional upon it being dark and you not being able to identify who it is. Because if you can identify who it is, you need to make an accusation to the judge that this person was stealing, right? Then they have to pay back what? 1/5 of what they stole. But if it's at night and you don't know who it is, you can put them down. And that is punishable. That is stealing being punishable by death with some mitigating factors. So Torah comes along and gives some mitigating factors to these 10 commandments, right? For example, why do we not have idols? What was the reason for that? Why do we not take the Lord's name in vain? And what does that consist of? Here's my point. My point is that the 613 explain the 10. The 10 explain the 2 explain the 1. However, I am here today to totally turn your world upside down. But we had to work through this first. We had to go through and say, okay, here's tradition at the bottom. All these bylaws, all these things. I mean, fornication, spitting on the ground and making mud, picking sheaves of wheat on the Sabbath. Those are all traditions, right? What's another one that I can think of on the Christian side? Oh, I know I can go with one here. Basically that you have to believe in the Trinity in order to be saved. That's the Nicene Creed. Okay, so in principle, then, when we are looking at all of these things of traditions, they don't hold any water. And here's the intrigue. We're created to administrate control over the people. Meaning what? Meaning it's an it's an external locus of control. It is life happening to you, not life happening for you. Tradition is actually the flesh. Tradition is the ego. Tradition is the action of getting worked up about an expectation that a person remove their hat when they pray, when it actually doesn't say that. And then we have to ask, well, why did he tell the priest to cover their heads, right? Then we have to factor in things like, for example, why do I have to stand and pray? Or why do I have to sit down and pray? Just depends on who you go to, right? I could go on and on about Christian tradition. Why do we have to have a song service in a Christian church? Why do we have to have a sermon on a Sunday morning? You know what would happen if a pastor walked in and said, we're not actually having a sermon today. We're actually going to fellowship for the rest of the day. Done. People would have a fit. They would want to know why in the world he wasn't given a sermon, etc. Right? Okay. So tradition, bad, right? Tradition, ego. So we can actually put on our board here, over here, we can put ego, and here we can put spirit. Or better yet, and I'll put this in parentheses, Elohim and Ha-Satan. Okay, now, I know that immediately people are like, oh man, the bylaws, oh man, the Westminster Confession, it's like the big deal. It's like the most important thing is part of our faith and blah, blah, blah. And oh, the catechism and oh, the Talmud. Oh my gosh, if you tell a rabbi that the Talmud is an ego trip, they would have a fit. But it absolutely is. It is to control the people. Why? Because the people, I'm going to make this go away for a second so it's not a distraction, so that you can hear me. The people can't be trusted to actually be servants of God. They have to be told how to be servants of God. And the proof is that there's a written Torah. Yes and no. Because here's something that's very important. You need to remember that if something is written down, it is activated. Okay? If you write down a spell in witchcraft, it is activated. If you write down a covenant between Israel and the God of creation, it is activated. Okay? But Paul says there's a spirit of the law, right? Okay, we're going to get into this. So the premise is the stronger that your ego is, the more you're going to need to be controlled and therefore have scriptural presuppositions control your life through tradition, right? But as we begin to move up the ladder, as it were, right? As we begin to ascend and not descend, as we begin to ascend, we start to lose the need to be controlled. And as we move further up into the commandments, there is less and less control. Thou shalt not murder encompasses a whole process of mercy and justice, right? Love your neighbor as yourself will prevent murder, theft, false witness, etc., right? And love in general without any limitation or definition of condition, obviously, is at the highest level. It's where you don't even have to think about whether it's love the Lord your God or love your neighbor. It's just a state of existence of that. Obviously, we start to get into something interesting. What we see down here at the bottom, oh, let me switch back my whiteboard here. What we see down here at the bottom is what? Lower energy vibration. How do I know? Because those traditions are not designed to make things better. They're designed to tell you what to do because you can't control yourself or because you are not trusted by the administration. Think about this. You have a prisoner of war. Okay, let's say that we go and we attack a country and we take prisoners of war because we're a merciful country and we don't execute them, we just take them and they're prisoners of war. Why do you tie them up? Why is there a fence around your little containment facility? Because you don't trust them. You don't trust them that they will stay there. You don't say, you are a prisoner of war. You stay here in this place and don't go out that door. It's unlocked, but don't go out it. And not only don't you go out it, but don't you dare run away. Don't you run away. No, we put a fence around it. In my point, tradition is a prison fence. Tradition is a fence to prevent you from having as much freedom as Torah actually grants you. Okay, now don't get me wrong, because this is tradition, right? Okay, this is tradition, right? Lighting the candles on Shabbat is tradition. Hanukkah is tradition. Purim is tradition, right? Searching for comets with a feather and a dustpan is tradition. I'm not saying that tradition is bad. I'm saying that it is something that is required as a result of the fact that you can't even handle the 613 or the 1048. I am telling you that you need Christian bylaws or you need Talmud because you actually either A, can't be trusted with the Torah itself or with the actual 66 books of the Bible. You need something more than just that. And by the way, as a progressive doctrinal logical process, Christianity generally teaches the people to believe that the only one who can really know how to interpret scripture and the only one who can actually legitimately execute divine processes is the pastor. And therefore, the people all go to the pastor. Oh, pastor, help us. The pastor's like, okay, I got to mow my lawn. I got to counsel this guy. I got to tell this couple not to do that. I've got to preach my sermon. I got to prepare my sermon because I'm the only one that's allowed to what? Interpret scripture. No. What are we doing here at After His Heart Ministries? I'm training my replacements. And hopefully I'm training more than one because in the end, I would love for when you go train your replacements that there are a whole bunch more so that people stop being parrots and that people start thinking for themselves and that people stop following tradition. Okay. They stop following fossilized customs like Christmas. So in that case, right, one of the things that we need to do is figure out how this elevating works. Well, I got to share with you two things that are important. Number one, good old John. Oh boy. You know, I love the man. I really do. And he's not the one who I actually would like to get into a sparring match with physically. That would be Paul. I really want to pop him. But and I definitely do want to actually tackle the man who came here and died for me. I want to tackle him. But that's another story. What I'm trying to say is that if I sat down with John, there would probably be a good, 60,000 years of silence as I just sat there tapping my fingers because he's a great mystic, right? He's an amazing writer. Had the nerve to say that God is love. After all of this stuff we have about traditions, the 1048, the 613, the 10, the 2, love, and all of a sudden God is love. Two things I know. Number one, he didn't write that in Greek. He wrote that in Hebrew, which really complicates things. That says Elohim is love. But we really, really need to do something here. We need to go from the word that's used in the Greek to see how damaging it is to the Hebrew, to the ancient pictographic Hebrew, to let go of all the other BS. Okay? So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to actually go to the verse that says God is love. Okay? And so, of course, that is going to be in John. And so in First John. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate there first. And while I'm navigating there, this is one of the things I want you to think about. What you think you know about love, you don't. Yes, I apologize. That is totally, totally true. You think that you understand what the word love is, but you need to understand you were raised as a Greek. And when we get into the inappropriateness of that thought process, then we really start to understand things a little bit better. Okay? So, in that premise, we are going to be going to First John, and I believe that we are going to chapter 4. We'll go ahead and hook up the HDMI cable here to the tablet. I've been charging it so that we won't have to unhook. And we're going to go ahead and transition over here, make that go away. Okay. Beloved, may we love one another because the love is of God, and everyone who is loving of God, he hath begotten and doth know God. He who is not loving did not know God, because God is love. So, 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, okay, in the Greek. What we're looking for is that word right there, agape. Agape, right? Now, I know that this has become cliche. We've got agape veterinary. We've got agape massage. We've got agape love versus eros versus philo versus pragma, right? We've got the 5 loves and all this other hogwash that has nothing to do with the ancient pictographic Hebraic interpretation and therefore lifestyle of a nomad. Okay. So, real simple. All that we're going to do is we're just going to go over here to the Thayers. And we're going to say, okay, Thayers, what is the Septuagint equivalent? Okay, I will remind you. Septuagint is a Greek interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures by Jews for Ptolemy, Philadelphia, for the Library of Alexandria, which consequently the Jews put in there a logical Greek cultural equivalent of a deep Hebrew mystic process. In other words, they took the mythos, changed it to logos, and shoved it down the throat. Okay. And so there is not a mystical process in the Greek writings of the Septuagint, but there is a mystical process in the ancient pictographic Hebrew. So obviously, right off the bat, boom, here we are. Here's our Hebrew, Hava, right? Hava. And we jump into a Hava. And here we are. And you see that the root is ahav. Okay? Real simple word, ahava, love, right? So we jump over to our Hebrew root. So now let's go ahead and jump onto the we'll jump onto the whiteboard for a minute and start documenting this. So at the start, we're going with what? We're going with agape. So let's see, that's going to be that, and that's going to be that, and that is going to be that, and then that is going to be, shoot, I can't remember how to do a Greek P. The pi, right? Okay. Yep. And then agape is going to end with the EY sound, agape. Okay, so there's agape in Greek, right? We'll go ahead and write it over here in English for people to know what it is that I am writing. Agape, unless, of course, my English looks like Greek, and then you just have to get over it. Okay, so now the next thing that we got going on, let's go ahead and let's put some Hebrew on the board, and that is going to be Aleph, right? Hey, Beit. I'm going to write over this blue just a smidge. Hey, and this is Ahava, right? Ah. Ha, va, ahava. Okay. And so then obviously then that comes down to our Aleph, Hey, Beit. And before I go any further, some of you may have noticed that we possibly may already have a parent root, right? And for a very good reason. There's 2 letters in there that we should be familiar with. However, we're going to go ahead and go with it. We're going to say this is ahav. Actually, let's go ahead and continue using the green and be consistent. Ahav. That's not how we do that. Ahav. That was actually a Freudian slip. You'll see later. Okay, so now what we need to do is get it into the ancient pictographic Hebrew. Now, there's 2 things that are important here. The first one is that we actually have in front of us the lexical root, right? This is the lexical root. In fact, let's put that in the orange. That can go in the orange. We have the lexical root here. But we got to go back further, right? This is just the Strong's Concordance or the Young's Analytical Concordance or the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon root, okay? And that is because there's 3 letters, right? 1, 2, 3. And that is as far as it goes. However, that's where Christianity stops and the Hebrew roots movement begins. So what are we going to do now? We're going to say, this is what? This is a child root. How do I know? Let's take a look at child root. So child root is really simple. Basically, it has to have a yod, a hey, a vav, an aleph, or a doubled last letter, which I will represent with X's, okay? And that is a child root. Child roots can trace the parent very easily because we just drop one of those letters. So we're either going to drop the aleph or we're going to drop the hey, right? But we don't know which one yet because there is a great mystery behind this word. Now, having said all that, now what we need to do is jump back into our text. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to jump over to our Thayers. We're going to jump over to Ahava, and we're going to look at first usage, which is going to be in Deuteronomy 7:8. Because of Yahweh's loving you, and because of his keeping the oath which he has sworn to your fathers, hath Yahweh brought you out by a strong hand, and doth ransom you from the house of servants, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So Deuteronomy 7:8 is the first usage of ahava. So we'll go ahead and we will go to the root ahav, right? And then I'm just going to get the Strong's Concordance number here. And I'm going to get the Strong's Concordance number because I'm just going to copy it. And then I'm going to jump over to lexicon, ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible. We're just going to put that in as a search and see whether the aleph or the hey is what gets dropped. We don't know which. Why? Because they both can be dropped. Not together, of course, but they can be dropped. And so as a result, what do we have? We have 158, and we have the word Yahav to allow, I'm sorry, not Yahav, Ahav, beloved, one who is loved, okay? So now that is what? That is a child root, CR. What we need to do is go back to the ancient pictographic parent root, the PR, which is here, okay? So, intriguingly enough, hey, bait is the actual root. And it means gift, gift. The abstract is love. And the action is to give. Okay? Let's read our ancient pictographic definition. We'll go ahead and put that in blue. The pictograph, hey, represents one who is looking at a great sight, his hands raised as when saying, behold. The bait is a representation of the tent or house. Combined, these pictures mean look toward the house or provide for the family. Now, here's the ancient nomadic definition, right? The ancient nomadic definition is one does not choose the household which one is born into, including the tribe, parents, children, and wife, as marriages were often arranged by the father. It is a gift from God. These gifts are seen as privileges and are cherished and protected. Okay? All right. So what do we got going on here? Well, let's just look at this for a minute, okay? Let's talk about the tent. The tent is provision, protection, instruction, right? Provision, protection, instruction is inside the tent. Comes from what? The authoritative unit of process inside the tent. Remember, this is only metaphorical, all right? There are a lot of variations upon how an actual survival in a tent would happen. So let's be careful not to literalize this, and all of a sudden we've got some new tradition, right? Okay. So within the tent is provision, protection, and instruction. The act of repentance or returning to God, right, is the process of turning back towards the tent. The two front teeth and the drawing of the tent representing press to the tent, like your teeth pressing down, placing pressure towards the tent, moving towards the tent. That's shuv. That's returning to what? The provision, protection, and instruction. How do you return to provision, protection, and instruction? Well, first of all, you put yourself in a position to be protected, meaning what? You allow protection to exist. You receive protection. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you're a celebrity and you need a bodyguard. And that bodyguard is going to make sure that we don't have any weird fans who would like you dead and like to put you in a cabinet somewhere. So now what's going to happen is they're going to go along with you beside you to make sure that you don't become a curio, right? And so they're going to put their lives in front of yours to keep you safe. But let's say that you say that you as a celebrity say to your bodyguard, it's okay. I'm going to go in here alone. What have you done? You have ceased to receive protection, right? Okay. Now, next, besides that, is the premise or principle that protection is what? It is something that demonstrates that you yourself cannot protect yourself, which means there's an admission that you would need to come to. The Hebrew word for receive is kabal, right? Kabal. Now, if it is in the feminine form, it's Kabbalah. So when you Kabbalah something, that means that you are operating in a feminine principle as a vessel of reception, right? Remember, Peter mentioned something about wives or husbands dwelling with their wives with understanding because they are the weaker vessel. Okay, so now, not diminishing in value and not in significance, but in the very simple fact that they are in a state of reception. Children are in a state of reception. In fact, when Yeshua said, except you become as little children, you by no one enter the kingdom of heaven, and the kingdom of heaven is in you, and I'll let you figure that one out. But here is one of the bigger principles, and that is that provision, protection, and instruction have to be received in order to be effective. Instruction has to be received in order to be effective. Provision has to be received in order to be effective. But here we are with provision actually being the action of love. And so now we got to get into gift. Okay, first of all, when you think about the word gift, obviously there's some of you who might think about the cone cap on top of your head and the birthday cake in front of you and blowing out the birthday candles. Some of you may think about the Christmas gifts under the tree. Some of you may think about the one time when your grandma gave you a ring and it's special and you still keep it in your jewelry box. Some of you may think about something that your grandfather or uncle carved for you, etc. Okay. The point is that the word gift triggers an imagination, and that imagination is based upon frames of reference. Let that go. Because the way that you need to think about this is more along the lines of inheritance. Gift is inheritance. Authority is a gift. It is inherited, right? Property ownership is a gift. It is inherited, right? We talked about this when we talked about covenant. So let's just for a moment step back away from scripture. We'll just go ahead and let all this go for a moment, and we will talk a little bit more logically, because obviously in front of you is a state of experience by which you have frames of reference. So let's talk about that. In the morning, when the birds start chirping, darkness begins to turn to light. That is a scientific process. It follows a physical law, right? It follows rules. It has definition and limitation. And yet, the thing that's causing that light, once it's in the sky, this fireball, right? This nuclear fusion generator, what? Heats, radiates, dries out, and lights the earth, right? Okay. So in principle, then we understand when we're looking at that, which don't look at that. Let's say the different way. When we're considering that, we don't think in our minds that it's not going to rise tomorrow. In fact, tomorrow really actually means that it is going to rise, right? Even the thought of tomorrow means that the sun is still going to do what the sun has always done. Why is this so important? Because when we're dealing with the intensification of all power in the universe, we need to understand that we can't think of him in terms of the physical laws, but we can do one thing. Paul said that the wrath of God is poured out upon those who suppress the knowledge of the truth, right? And then the second thing he said was, for everything that has been made tells of his eternal power, his divine attributes, and his nature, right? Okay. So in principle, then we can say that by looking at the sun, we can determine something about him. Well, what can we determine? He's bigger than that, right? But there are balls of fire out there that could engulf our entire solar system. And so we can't really jive with that. But what we can do is say that he's bigger than everything. Okay, that's a good logical, linear logical conclusion. Anything that exists, he is bigger than it. Why is that important? Well, because basically then we can kind of conclude that anything that we see in process is actually outside of the existence of this entity. Okay? Or should I say inside existence? He's outside. Okay. So, in principle, what we really need to start to understand then is how is love, or how is God love? What do we know? We know the word God or theos is not what was actually written in First John. First John was written in Hebrew. John was a Hebrew purist. In fact, if you listen to Polycarp, John was more strict in his adherence to Torah than any other one of the disciples. So now, when we are looking at the thought process of love being an Elohim, well, that can get into some complications, can't it? Because we are Elohim, right? Psalm 82. And furthermore, the ground is an Elohim. How do we know? Because God commanded it to bring forth the trees. We know that the sea is an Elohim. Why? Because God commanded it to bring forth things. It had creative power and therefore had its own process of existence with the ability to create. Yes, that means that we really need to let go of the word God when we're dealing with this stuff. And we need to start getting into this greater thought process of intensity of energy versus a lack of intensity of energy. And then also we can even get into frequency and vibration, because obviously when we are dealing with negative things, what are negative things? Well, okay, first of all, let's just pick a commandment, okay? Let's say that we go with murder. Murder. Yes, murder is a good one. Why? Because it carries all the way into the traditions. So at the very top, we have love. If we were in a constant state of love, which we have not even touched upon what that means yet, we're not in a constant state of love, then we are actually going to have to go with love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, love the Lord your God with all your heart has nothing to do with murder. Love your neighbor as yourself has something to do with what? You're not going to kill if you don't want to be killed. But now we go into the 613. Do you lie in wait to strike a man, or was it an accident? If it was an accident, you go to prison, right? You go to the city of refuge, and you are not allowed to leave those city walls until the high priest dies. Okay? So basically, an indeterminate sentence in a walled city, prison. So manslaughter equates to prison. What does lying in wait? If you planned it, if you intended to kill the man, then lying in wait then becomes what? Death by a return on investment. You crack somebody upside the head with a club, guess how you're going to die? Somebody's going to Louisville you, okay? And so from that point of view, the way that I want you to think about this is when it's intentional, it's murder. We don't see that in thou shalt not murder. We see that in Torah. But what then does Yeshua bring to the table? If your intention of murder was as a result of what? Hate in your heart, then if you hate, you've already committed it in your heart. And out of the abundance of the heart, words come, which means you will bring about a state of existence in which that murder will occur. Okay? That's a whole other level, I know. Getting into the traditions, now we understand that if anybody says, I hate somebody, a Christian tradition is to say, oh, that's murder. You're committed murder in your heart, right? But now let's go a little bit lower. Where did that hate come from? That hate came from a wound. That hate came from vain imaginations, constructs about what? Your actual image, your actual identity, right? Remember, it's not what you do that makes you who you are, but what you believe about yourself, you will do. So if you murder, it's because you believed you were a murderer. Well, who taught you that, right? Okay, you guys get my point here. Murder, theft, adultery, covetousness, false witness, all correspond to a twisted head or evil, right? Ra, right? The resh and the ayin, or consequently, I should say the resh and the ga, the head and the twisted rope, or the twisted head, the twisting of the head, now becomes what? The lowest of frequencies. When you are in your wounds and you are in your limiting beliefs and you are not using your imagination, there is almost zero vibration. All of your negative emotions are focusing on hate, bitterness, anger, sadness, depression. Okay? Low vibrations, low frequencies. Higher frequencies is happiness, right? And contentment, gratitude, love. love, right? And this love, this ahava, uh, this a and this bait being behold the tent. In other words, take notice of the provision, protection, and instruction. In order to what? What is taking notice? How do we take notice? We admit that we need it, right? And so now, by adding in the lead ox or the aleph, it becomes love or the action of giving or the action of receiving. Now, getting back into our text real quick here, we will go over to ahava or ahav, right down here. And it says the expressions and actions toward the family, which one was privileged with. Okay. But then we get into it as a verb, ahav, love, to provide and protect that which is given as a privilege, an intimacy of action and emotion, strong affection for another arising from personal ties. Okay. So here's the part where you guys obviously are going to have a difficult time. Because in its simplicity, what we have here in this hierarchy, we have love at the top. And this love at the top, which is kind of tiny up here, maybe I can put some attention getters up there real quick so that this stands out just a smidge more because it's very, very, very important. Okay. Pick the wrong one here. There we go. There's our attention getters. Here's love, right? But what is it? What is it meaning? What is the concept here? The concept is provision, protection, and instruction. You see it right there in the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible definition. Let's look at it again. To provide and protect that which is given as a privilege, an intimacy of action and emotion, strong affection for another arising from personal ties. Okay, so now what we need to do is get into what we would call emotional attachment. So how are we going to do this? What we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about that process. So inside of us all is the mammal, right? Because we have the attributes of a mammal, usually hair, vertebrae, mammary glands, and of course, the herd instinct. So let's put on the board really quick a documentation of that thought process. We'll go ahead and just document the concepts here. So what we have is we have an animal, right? And what does the animal have as its process? Well, first of all, it has in it self-preservation. Right? Self-preservation, which falls into the category of what? Protection. Protection. Okay. What's the second thing here? We have what? We have this idea of connection, connectivity, connection, the herd, right? Connectivity, connection. Okay. And that is going to stay blank for a moment. And then, of course, we have what? We have the idea of reproduction. Reproduction. Now, however it works out, obviously you could see self-preservation has protection in it, but it also has provision in it, right? It has provision in it. Self-preservation has provision. And what's interesting is connection also has what? Protection. There is strength in numbers, a safety in numbers. The herd sticks together and therefore is safe. Now, let's talk about preservation. Self-preservation is a built-in, innate tendency towards keeping oneself safe? No, not actually. Interestingly enough, it is not safety per se. It's comfort. It's comfort. It is the difference between being uncomfortable and comfortable. In the end, discomfort is actually what's activating self-preservation instinct. I know that sounds insane, because then what we get into is, okay, well, all that's really happening when a predator or an enemy comes at us is they create discomfort. And the moment that discomfort is gone, we forget that it happened. We don't understand the level at which we were or were not protected until we are protected. And when it's done and over with, we often forget that incident in its fullest discomfort. Now, there's exceptions to that, obviously, if there isn't protection and the trauma occurs. But the way that I want you to think about this is I want you to go, okay, self-preservation in general is just a movement of the body physically or the mind mentally away from discomfort. That's it. That's all self-preservation is. It's a movement away from danger or what? Fear, right? Fear being what? A imagination about danger. All right. So then what is the big deal about connection? What does connection create? Well, depending on how the dynamic plays out, for example, a singular male in a herd is either an alpha or is a beta, right? In the sense of they are either a leader or a follower. They are either a manager or a person being managed, right? And then there is this idea or thought process that also has to do with frequency, because a manager is controlling people. A leader is controlling people. An alpha male in a wolf pack is controlling the pack and does not necessarily provide provision, protection, and instruction, does it? No, because the self-preservation instinct causes that individual male to operate a certain way within the herd. Followers will follow the leader. The leader will decide the best interest of the herd. So connection for a male has to do with has to do with creating a group or a corporate conscience connection to the leader. Whereas a female comes into a connectivity or into a herd, and what? There is an element of not only safety present in that process, but also it's going to be very difficult for the female to necessarily assert as an alpha. Okay. Having said that, it's not necessarily unheard of in the animal kingdom. We see it a lot with lions, somewhat with wolves, but the principle is that generally when a female is in a herd, she is safe because of the other males. Okay. All right. So why is this important? Because then what we have to do is figure out, A, how are you going to prove that you are an alpha or a beta B, how are you going to determine whether you are safe or not, etc. The herd process is this huge old ball of mistrust. And singularly trust in specific individuals in the herd. Okay. Now, granted, in general, then that means that people are going to tend towards wanting a leader. They're going to tend towards wanting instruction. So, connection pertains specifically not as much to protection, but to instruction. Okay. And so we can put instruction here. Instruction. That generally speaking, connection is about instruction. It's about leadership and about following. Okay, now we get to reproduction. And here's the interesting thing about reproduction. Before you get too far into the bedroom with it, I want you to think about everything that actually needs to be reproduced. I am training my replacements, which means what? I am currently reproducing. Okay. And so the whole idea behind reproduction is to what? To preserve the species and to what? Propagate the next generation. So two very big pieces of that puzzle include the intimate connection between the masculine and feminine principle, between the student and the master, between the manager and the employee, between the mother and the child, between the head of the household and the people who they are providing for, etc., etc. The masculine and feminine principle, the bestowing versus the receiving, the giving versus the receiving, the love versus the receiving. Okay. So let's talk a minute about that from the point of view now of emotional attachment. Self-preservation on its own does not govern by morals or ethics. Self-preservation is an instantaneous movement away from discomfort. It's as simple as that. It does not care who you are. It doesn't care what property is there. It doesn't operate that way. All it does is move away from the discomfort. The best example of this is a stampede of cattle, where they just tear through everything. They will drag a barbed wire fence for miles before they stop. Okay. Self-preservation does not equate to the actual community. It does not equate to connection. In fact, it is the opposite of connection in a lot of ways, because the herd itself, although each individual is the sum of all the parts, causing a self-preservation as a result of the connection, each individual is making the choice to be a part of that connection in order to self-preserve. It's one of the ways they're moving away from discomfort or fear. Okay. So self-preservation at its finest is self-ish, meaning what? That it does not take into consideration the other. Okay. So now when we get into connection, we can see that there are times where people put themselves in a position in a herd when they weren't invited. Or people are forced to be part of a herd in order to create a greater good. Okay. You could think about that in terms of military conscription. Point being is that there's not necessarily an ethical boundary that says how a herd is supposed to be formed. Okay. And whether the herd is effective or not is not necessarily contingent upon its likability. Then, of course, when we get into reproduction, I don't have to explain to you the inappropriateness of a lack of morals, lack of ethics. But in general, one of the things you also want to think about is that concept of forcing another generation of the same thing that we had before. This is where it's a concern when it comes to reproduction. And I'm not going to use those words that describe how you force something to reproduce, but I want you to think about cultural forced reproduction, where you try to assert your traditional thought processes, political views, and values upon another in order to try to get them to agree with you and stand with you through dubious means. Okay, so there's our instincts, right? There's our instincts. That is basically our kinesthetic movement type of informational system that we have in place in us that has a balance set of two other very significant influencers. So our next process needs to come in the form of how we address things in emotional sense. Two things that are very important. The first one is that emotions are just hormonal responses to either new stimulus or framed reference stimulus. What do I mean by that? I mean that emotional responses can be the result of an actual new stimulus or can be triggered by the similarity of a stimulus. In fact, in general, we know that memories are context sensitive. You have to feel the same emotion. You have to have some sort of thing that causes your brain to go, oh, I know that smell. And then boom, we've got a memory. Oh, I know that emotion. And then boom, we've got a memory. Okay? Yes, this is wounds. Of course, that's a big part of this, right? This is wounds. But we want to look at this also from the point of view of what is an emotional attachment. An emotional attachment is where an emotion is connected to an experience that had instinctual processes with it. Okay. Reproduction requires a masculine and feminine principle in order to have conception. So as a result of that, then what we have is reproduction requiring there to be a coupling, reproduction requiring to be a connection between the masculine and feminine, and thereby there needs to be some sort of bonding that occurs, a sub connection, right? A sub herd or a family, right? And we'll get into that thought process in a minute. Because what we're going to eventually get to here is this idea that when we're dealing with a unit of people of some sort, there is an offspring of that unit. So now, as we're getting into the idea of emotional attachment, we have hormones that offer bonding connections, and we have hormones that offer good feelings, right? Hormones that offer good sensations in the body that then equate to our word, love. But that is not the Hebrew word for love. I'm going to get to this, okay? And so the next element that we need to address then is cognition. What actually is cognition? Well, this is going to shock you because a lot of you don't realize that this is what it is, but in its simplicity, it is pictures. We are, in general, a picture-oriented people. Now, some people have that suppressed significantly, and some people have that overemphasized significantly. But in general, our cognition is a picture story that we create and play in our mind, an actual movie that we play in our mind that has audio and visual and is very much similar to a movie. And that also has frames of references that are related to various hormonal dispensations. Okay. So our picture movies become the attachment to. So what does that mean? That means that we have what we would call an expectation. An expectation is a congruity of agreement between our imagination and predictable patterns that we have noticed neurolinguistically within a human being. So you ever had this happen where you're doing something and a person comes along and does something a certain way and you're like, oh man, that was totally out of character. That is an example of us neurolinguistically observing patterns of behavior that have nothing to do with the person's mouth, have nothing to do with their attitude, just have to do with patterns and them deviating from that pattern, which what? Violates the expectation, screws up the movie, right? So now other hormones are released, and those hormones are anxiety, right? Those hormones um, are things that cause us to elevate our senses in such a way that we're hyper aware, right? And in hyper awareness, all anxiety is the hormones required to cause you to be hyper aware, so that you're more aware of the peripheral, right? You're more aware of the peripheral and you're more aware of the future. You're more aware of the predictability or the expectations, right? That's all really anxiety is expectations. Okay. So in that process, though, we have what we would call stress, and that would be that there's an actual response physically from the body. You say, well, what has this got to do with love? You'll see. And so now in all of that process, what we have then is we have actions and choices and words that are produced as a result of these emotional attachments or these frames of reference that are connected to these expectations that may or may not come to pass. And when they don't come to pass, that creates an incongruity and therefore a psychological discomfort that we will what? Move away from in self-preservation. So why is all of this important? Well, because that is our version of love. It's a picture movie expectation combined with the predictability of patterns of neurolinguistic behavior that creates and elicits very specific types of hormones like the bonding hormones or the connection hormones, right? Or the feel good hormones that equates to us saying the word love. But is that actually what it's talking about in the Hebrew? And is that actually what it's talking about in the writings, right, of John? Well, first of all, when we talk about Elohim, we instantaneously want to put that word God on there. Let me flip that around. When we talk about God, we instantaneously want to put, this old man on the throne with a long white beard and, all the other things that we have as constructs of this idea of this entity outside of us and completely dichotomous to us. What does that mean? That means completely separated from us, different from us enough that there's no actual ability to relate. So if we're looking at this idea of looking towards the tent, what is something that we know right off the bat? If you're looking towards the tent, where are you? You are outside tent. Okay? That's the first one. So why are you outside the tent? Well, there are two reasons to be outside the tent. One is the result of sin, which would be shame, right? That's bush, that's press away from the tent, intentional leaving of provision, protection, and instruction in order to what? In order to fulfill some deficit, desire. Remember, desire is deficit. It's a hole in you that can't be filled except by one singular process. But either way, you leave the tent, you go out with the intention of trying to fulfill that desire. Once you go out and try to fulfill that desire, you are outside the tent, you are stripped naked. You have no longer any provision, protection, and instruction. You are exposed to the elements, your genitals are exposed, and you become dried as a result of being exposed to the sun and the wind, which are both all metaphorical elements of shame. Remember, he covered his nakedness because he was ashamed. But remember, in the beginning, they were naked and unashamed. And so the process and the indication here is that if you're outside the tent for that reason and you look towards the tent, then there's a longing for that provision, protection, and instruction. What's the other reason to go outside the tent? To tame, right? To tame and cultivate, to tame the animals. What animals? Those three instincts I was talking about. People operating in their ego instead of in their Elohimness, right? People operating in their fears and imaginations instead of in their their higher self, right? Okay, so we're taming. Then we're what? We're also tending the crops. We're planting seed. We're cultivating the ground. We're watering. We're fertilizing. We are bringing about a change in the process of a seed from death into life, from death into life, right? Lowered it down into the water, into the ground, in death, and raised in newness of life. The recycling process of a seed turning into a sprout and then to a stalk. And we what? We maintain that whole process of change from this point to this point in elevation. So we are out what? We are taming the animal and then we are elevating, right? Those are the two things that we're doing when we're outside the fence. I'm sorry, outside the tent, unless we're outside there because of shame, which is what? Sin, which is a separation. Okay. Now, the reason why this is important is because both of them are looking at the tent with a longing for what? Provision, protection, and instruction. A longing for order. A need to turn back to the tent and go into the tent and again be able to eat like the Father's servants eat instead of eating the pods from the pig feet, right? A longing to return to the tent after the rebellious and adulterous Gomer has been sold on the auction block because she's no longer worth her prostitution and being purchased back and brought back into the tent, brought back into the unit, brought back into the clan. Meaning what? That love is actually a longing for order. Now this starts to make sense, right? Because what do we have at the bottom? We've got tradition, and then we've got what? The 1048. Then we've got the 613. Then we've got the 10. Then we've got the 2. Then we've got the 1. And the 1 actually is Elohim. All this makes sense now, right? So at the bottom, we have an absolute animal who has to be manipulated, coerced, and forced to behave, right? In fact, the irony is not only does it have to be manipulated and forced to and coerced to behave, right, through reward and consequence and threats and everything else. Look at what he says. He says, when you eat from the tree, you will surely die. That's a threat. That's a threat. That is not rewarding obedience as a result of good behavior. That's saying, if you do bad, I will do this. right? So that is creating consequence. That is actually negative, low frequency process. There are, according to Maimonides, 248 positive thou shalts, all resulting in a reward if kept, right? And there are 365 thou shalt nots, which are all what? Accompanied by a threat. Okay. And so on the one side, you have the conditioning of reward. Let's talk a minute about Pavlov's dog, right? So Pavlov takes and sews little plastic sacks on the saliva glands of his dog. And in that process, then he offers the dog food. The dog salivates. Then he introduces another stimulus. He rings a bell. Ringing that bell actually gives an action of what? Of a belief or an instance of food, right? Ringing the bell creates an instance in the dog's mind, food's coming. So he rings the bell, feeds the dog. Rings the bell, feeds the dog. Then he rings the bell and he doesn't feed the dog, and the dog still salivates. He rings the bell, doesn't feed the dog still salivates. Over and over and over again, this dog continues to salivate until eventually the dog realizes there's no reward present. And then what happens? Desensitization. The dog stops salivating. The bell is rung. He reintroduces the food, reintroduces the bell, and the process all over. The most amazing human behavior experiments of all time actually was done on this dog. And it proves and shows the law of effect, or what's called classical conditioning, which is the concept or the idea that a reward has to accompany a stimulus, or there'll be a desensitization to that response. And that is not voluntary, that is autonomic. Okay. And so a reward then results in good behavior because the good behavior was met with a reward. The promise is received. Therefore, that entity now believes that a reward will come as a result of obedience. Now they will be obedience. That's training. Welcome to tradition. That's exactly what's going on in tradition. That's exactly what's going on at the lowest level of all this, is a controlling of the people through reward and consequence, through threats, force, coercion, etc., or through manipulation of saying, hey, we'll give you a bone if you go do this thing. So what is the idea of tradition? It is social acceptance. Therefore, it falls into the area of connection, connectivity, right? The herd. Does the herd approve of what you're doing? Does it have anything to do with the 66 books of the Bible? Or better yet, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, or better yet, the Torah, or better yet, the spirit of the Torah, or better yet, the energy of the intensification of all power in the universe? No, it does not. At that lowest level, you are being controlled. At that lowest level, you are adhering to rote memorization and tradition as opposed to actual action that is within the realm of all that. So now a Christian comes along and says, oh, all I do is love. No, you don't. You are a wounded, full of limiting beliefs, lack of imagination, human being doing damage to other people, and most likely have vices and addictions that you're not talking to anybody about. And also, in addition to that, most likely were wounded very badly by other people. And so you're just perpetuating the darkness. Don't tell me you love. You don't even know what love means, because at the top of that line is the highest vibration of frequency. It is what we are supposed to attain to. That's why Paul said what he said about love. That's why he said what he said about how that is supposed to work. You see, all this time we've been thinking that love is some sort of sentiment. No, that is just your classical condition. You like how pretty somebody is, or you like how kind somebody is, or how comfortable somebody is with you, and that equates to love. You dislike how a person rubs you the wrong way, how they're edgy, how they do not connect with you, and that's somebody who you do not love. Unconditional love, the big claim of Christianity, is that there's unconditional love. This idea that we actually treat somebody a certain way, not because of who they are, their skin color, their sexual orientation, or all that. This is that American Christian doctrinal Christianity stuff, saying that that's what love is, when the truth is that it's actually the energy involved. And then we start to get into when we have imbalances in that as a result of negative emotions, and the picture shows that are creating expectations in an inappropriate manner, and that then turns into expectations that could never be met. And also, we can also take into consideration presuppositions, we can take into consideration wounds, assumptions that people are going to be a certain way. We are totally outside the realm of actual energy called love in the English. Energy of the intensification of all power in the universe, the highest vibration, not of obedience. If you have not gathered by now that the 10 commandments equate to 2 and the 2 equate to 1, and the one side, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with soul, and your might, has nothing to do with trying to give him something, then we realize that that is the reception, right? And then on the other side, love your neighbor as yourself has to do with some balanced, emotional, appropriate expectation, not violating the rights or the mental and emotional condition of others in order to self-preserve, connect, and reproduce. Then all of a sudden we get into this idea that it has to do with energy, it has to do with vibration, and we are literally talking about vibes. We're literally talking about an elevation. Now all of a sudden we understand that it is not just a sentiment. Listen, you are not a slave to your hormones. And you are not a slave to your picture shows. Okay? In fact, the only thing, according to Paul, that we are slaves to is equal distribution of justice and wealth. We're slaves of righteousness. And honestly, that word slavery doesn't really jive well either, right? This is not really how it should be or can be understood, but it is unfortunately how it ended up in the English. So what do we have here? The next time that you get bent out of shape, that somebody is not keeping a tradition the way you would expect it to, including things like sighting the moon, that's a tradition. Do you know that there's a big old to-do about a person sighting the moon versus using the rabbinical calendar versus using the Michael Rood calendar versus using all this other stuff, even within this congregation? And the truth is, it's a tradition. There is nowhere that says that we actually are supposed to sight the moon and execute process of feasts. Nowhere. We'll not find it in the Torah. In fact, it was the responsibility of the priests. In fact, it was the responsibility of the priests in the temple. Oh, we won't go there. Okay, so all I'm saying is that we're in tradition and you start getting bent out of shape, you need to remember all tradition is the control of humans. It is an expectation for people to do more than what it actually says. And getting mad or bent out of shape about that is ridiculous, because it was never instructed to you to light candles on Shabbat. So who cares when you light it? It was never instructed for you to light candles, right? It was never instructed for you to have challah on Shabbat. So who cares what ingredients are in the challah? Make cinnamon rolls for all I care, right? That's my point that I'm trying to make. It was never commanded to you to put presents under a tree. So who cares if you do or don't, right? We can get in later to the pagan application, but my point that I'm trying to make is if somebody gets been out of shape about how you decorate your tree, they can go fly a kite. It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. There are so many traditional processes and actions that occur within cultures that have nothing to do with the actual intent of the authors of their religious books. Nothing. Okay. Then we move up to the 1048. Now we're vibrating at a little bit higher frequency, probably a little bit less involved in reward and consequence, more involved in the preservation of the herd, right? And so we're in the 1048, which means what? Yeshua has taken murder to hate. He has taken adultery or the lust of another man's woman to adultery of the heart, which is punishable by death as an action that you do, right? When somewhere along the lines, loving your neighbor yourself definitely doesn't covet his wife, right? Okay. And so in that principle, then we see the 1048 then provide us with a very deep mystical understanding of the damaging vibrational processes of equating those things in your heart. Lust of the flesh in your heart for another man's wife is a coveting, which results in adultery. That's what Yeshua was saying. Don't even start it because you've already done it if you've committed it to your heart. And I will put out there that if we accept it, that just as much as he told us to pray and believe that we've already received, if you commit one of those in your heart, you are actually believing that you've already received and it will come your way. You will have an opportunity to murder if you hate. Okay? Doesn't mean you will. That's a whole nother level, right? Okay. So the concept or process, and then what we need to do is we need to shift our thinking into what is the balances and imbalances of the various levels of energy. Because when we move from the 1048 into the 613, now we're having clarification about the first 10. We're having clarification about what those mean, how they're supposed to be executed, and how what the mitigating circumstances are. If you think about it, the 613 are actually mercies upon the actual 10, okay? Or they are taking to the extreme the mystical interpretation of the actual 10. All right. And then, of course, as we get into the 2, we're really vibrating at a higher level because now we don't have to be told not to murder because why? Because do I want to be murdered? No. And how do I avoid murder? Well, first of all, I keep myself healthy and safe and protected, right? And then as a result of that, then I have an expectation to be treated that way. Then what? I am going to do that same for my neighbor. In fact, the sickness of hypocrisy is what makes it possible for a person to say, oh yeah, you shouldn't lust after that woman, and you're lusting after your neighbor's wife. Right? Okay. And so when we get into love, hava, then all of a sudden now we have what? 2 additional letters. But before we go any further, what I would like to show you is something that we would call a permutation. And it's not that much of a permutation, it's just a little one. So watch how this works. If we go back to a hava, if we go back to a hav, let me go ahead and go on the screen here. We go back to a hav here, okay? Then we are going to encounter 2 very significant letters. Okay. So what is our, first of all, let's do this. Let's go ahead and do a nice big red square indicating what our parent root actually is. Behold the tent. And then our augmentation is to strongly behold the tent. Remember, that's the ox's head, right? Behold the tent. And then what are we going to do? We are going to, instead of taking that parent root, we are going to permutate this, and instead of hay bait being the parent root, okay, we are going to switch it up, and we're going to look at this parent root, which is what? Father. And father is what? The strength of the tent. Which means what? It doesn't have to be a bloodline father. It can be the metaphorical concept of a father. All we know is it's a clan leader. It's an authority who's sovereign above all the rest. And the provider, or the intensity of provision, protection, and instruction. And so when we put in the word hey, it actually says, behold the Father. But it's in between the olive and the bait, which means that there is a strength, an observation, and then a tent. So the strength of observation of the tent, right? But we drop that hay out, and now we have what? We have Father. And so a permutation, or a block logic connection to provision, protection, and instruction, or the gift, or giving, or inheritance, now equates to what? The Father. What is a father in energy? Okay. Let's address that in just a moment. Let's talk about letting go of these anthropomorphic definitions and limitations we're placing upon something so intense that there's nothing more powerful or intense than it. What is a father in energy? A father is a higher consciousness. A father is a stronger intensity of energy. So it's interesting because we could get into some of the cultures around the world. Even the Native American culture has a tendency to call the most elderly, wisest person in the group grandfather, even if you were not born from his loins. Same thing is true of mother or father. In certain cultures and in certain tribal connections, father is actually just the chief, right? And so, interestingly enough, what we get into is the energy of the word father is authority, which again equates to yet another reference to that idea of sovereignty, and another reference to the idea of jurisdictional authority. And that goes back to our teaching about blessing, doesn't it? Because now, interestingly enough, we don't look at love as being some sentiment that you have for another, but instead an action, a process to provide or protect or value the reception of those things. So if a lesser loves a father, then that lesser is willing to receive provision, which equates to gratefulness, protection, which equates to humility, and instruction, which equates to the concept of receiving wisdom. Instruction is given by an authority that has more knowledge than the one who is receiving the instruction, Or that one who's receiving the instruction not only would not need the instruction, but would be the one giving instruction. Therefore, a student is the lesser. A student is in a state of reception, which requires openness, right? Remember our opening of the receiver, right? And requires what? A receiving and then, or an inception, a reception, and therefore a conception. There's an irony to the fact that what we learn in school are concepts, right? And so the premise is that what we're working with here is a universal process of A, openness, B, receiving, and C, responding by being obedient, humble, and grateful. Now, how does gratefulness work in the world of Hebrew? Do you say thank you? No, you never say thank you. In fact, hospitality is usually met with an understanding that you could never give anything to the entity who has been hospitable to you. And so you instead pronounce blessing upon them. Now, in that process, then we also have this idea that gratefulness doesn't have anything to do with saying thank you, but it has to do with consuming with intent to consume as a result of a belief that you could not consume without that provision. Protection. Humility is the willingness to admit that you can't actually protect yourself, that there is something out there more dangerous than what you can handle, and therefore you need somebody to look out for you in that, right? And then, of course, the instruction equates to obedience. But what people don't realize is the word obedience comes from the root word abed or obed, right? Which is what? Eved, right? Or avad, which is what? Bodah. It's translated slavery in Exodus, but it's translated work in other places. But it is servanthood, meaning what? Doing something for another. So it's interesting. Obedience to instruction will usually result in serving to another. If you look at what is the big deal, widows and orphans, right? Widows and orphans, the fatherless, right? The foreigner among you, the wage earner, right? We just saw this in our midrash about Malachi last night, where we see what? We see Yahweh complaining, saying that the wage earner, the widow, the orphan, the foreigner among you are not being taken care of. And that is in the same contextual connection with the top. And in the same contextual connection with Lashon Hara. Two big issues when it comes to the pew dwellers in this day and age. They gossip and they don't tithe. They church hop. They selectively like to have their ears tingled, right? But they don't actually contribute. And they love to make suggestions too. They'll call you in, they'll call in and say, hey, we should do this different in the ministry. Never even remotely lifting a finger in support, both financially and or physically. And then in addition to that, they will commit Lashon Hara. They will gossip. They will talk about the spiritual leader behind their back, right? Okay, those are the two big things that are the cause of the exploitation of the widow, the orphan, the exploitation of the wage earner, and the foreigner among us, which is actually an adopted son. The foreigner among us is an adopted son, somebody who's been adopted into the family of Israel. Okay. So when we talk about frequency, one of the things that I can prove beyond the shadow of a doubt is that there are very clear frequency vibration differences between negative emotions and positive emotions. between negative picture shows in your head and positive picture shows in your head. And that also can equate into conditions in the body, which results in a necessity for healing, which is one of the things Yeshua did. I mean, if you think about it, this is one of the things that just blows my mind about the Gospels that is not practiced today. Before there was evangelism, there was healing. Before there was evangelism, there was healing. Before there was evangelism, there was casting out of demons. Yeshua healed the mind, it's the demons, it's demonatio in the Greek, right? Contemporary Greek writers using that to describe somebody who's insane. It's not deal. And then the other is what? It is the physical ailments being healed, lame, blind, dead, leprous, palsy, issues of blood, all being healed before there is evangelism. That is where the church has thoroughly screwed up. So what we need to do is we need to start to think about love and its ability to balance the frequencies and the lack of frequency at the level of tradition, where we are fully being controlled outside of the actual original writings and therefore requirements. And then not allow the New Testament to augment the Old Testament, not as precedence over the Gospels, right? The Torah has precedence over Tanakh. That's what's important. It's that little filter and that little problem. When we go up to the 10, that we put the Sabbath back on the correct day, we put the concept of God damn it isn't the Lord's name in vain. Okay, we put the right understanding of the Lord's name in vain in place. We start really actually understanding what it means to have an idol, you know, like a phallic symbol in your, you know, living room on the 25th of December, or what it is to not have Yahweh be our Elohim. Okay. And so there's a lot of stuff that we need to understand. But what I can tell you, love is not a sentiment. It is not an emotional attachment. And it is not a response that has positive regard, not positive vibes, positive regard, right? Just because you like someone doesn't mean that you are activating love, because you are intimately involved in a relationship with someone in which hormones have given you the feeling like you are sentimentally attached to them. It's not love. Just because you treat somebody a certain way because you don't want to encroach upon their rights, that is not love. Love at its highest level is a very high frequency vibration that does not require any more interpretation of that. As we go down into the traditions, suddenly we start getting into ego, control of the people, external versus internal locus of control, factualization versus needing external validation, wounds, learning, lack of imagination, the absolute ineffective process of humanity, and therefore this loop that we are stuck in, which we actually have the nerve to believe there is a relief to without action, inaction, to consent. You are consenting to this world staying the way it is because you're so caught up in your traditions, your bylaws, your biases, and all of these other things, instead of realizing that love has nothing to do with your sentiment of how you think or feel about another human being. So for those of you on YouTube who are with us, I will go ahead and in this live stream and say Shabbat Shalom.